Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire expedition simply stops existing? Imagine a frozen wasteland where the sun barely skims the horizon, and the air is so cold it shatters steel like glass. In the spring of 1845, two majestic ships, the Erebus and the Terror, set sail from England with a clear objective: to conquer the legendary Northwest Passage. Sir John Franklin, a seasoned explorer, led 129 men into the white abyss of the Canadian Arctic. They were equipped with the finest supplies of the Victorian era, carrying enough preserved food to last for years. They were never seen alive again. What could force such a disciplined crew to abandon their reinforced, iron-plated vessels and vanish into a landscape that offers no mercy? For over a century, the silence of the ice held their secrets captive. Search parties found only haunting echoes, skeletal remains, abandoned tins of food, and scattered trinkets left in the snow. One chilling theory suggests that the men succumbed to a terrifying combination of lead poisoning from faulty canned goods and the creeping onset of madness, leading them to hallucinate under the grueling polar night. Others speak of a far more sinister fate, pointing to local Inuit testimonies that describe white men wandering in a state of utter delirium, their minds broken by starvation and the crushing weight of isolation. When the wrecks were finally located decades later, they sat perfectly preserved in the frigid depths, yet they offered no closure. What drove them to walk away from their sanctuary? The ice still guards the truth of their final hours, and somewhere beneath that eternal, frozen silence, the ghosts of the Franklin expedition continue to drift, waiting for an answer that may never come. Imagine a vast, silent expanse of white where time itself seems to have crystallized. You are standing on the edge of the Canadian Arctic, staring into a horizon that swallowed two of the finest ships in the British Royal Navy. In 1845, the Erebus and the Terror sailed into the frozen heart of the Northwest Passage, manned by 129 seasoned explorers. They were equipped for success, carrying vast supplies and the pride of an empire, yet they vanished into a void so absolute that their fate remained a haunting whisper for over a century. Why would two technologically advanced vessels, reinforced with iron plating and steam engines, simply cease to exist? Some believe the ships were caught in a vise of shifting ice, their hulls groaning under the pressure until the relentless cold claimed them. Yet, the scattered remnants of the crews told a much darker story. As the ships became locked in the pack ice, the men were forced into a desperate, agonizing march across a desolate tundra, carrying relics of their civilized lives that now served no purpose. One theory suggests that a combination of lead poisoning from faulty canned goods and the creeping onset of scurvy broke the sailors' minds before the frost could break their bodies. There were reports from local Inuit hunters of strange, delirious men wandering the wastes, shadows of the sailors they once were. What drove them to leave the relative shelter of their ships for the mercy of an endless, lethal winter? We look at the artifacts left behind: a single silver spoon, a scrap of uniform, a lock of hair, and we feel the chilling weight of their isolation. Their end remains a testament to the fact that when man ventures too far into the grip of nature's ancient, frozen teeth, he does not merely die. He is erased, leaving behind only an unanswerable question echoing across the ice. What does it feel like to vanish into a landscape that refuses to let you go? In the spring of 1845, the Terror and the Erebus set sail from England, their hulls reinforced with iron plating, their holds packed with 3 years of provisions. Sir John Franklin, a seasoned explorer, led this grand quest to conquer the Northwest Passage, a phantom sea route that promised fame and fortune. Yet, they sailed directly into a frozen purgatory from which they would never emerge. Imagine the silence of the high Arctic, broken only by the rhythmic groaning of pack ice against wood, a sound that shifted from a nuisance to a death knell as the ships became hopelessly locked in the grip of the Victoria Strait. By the time the crews abandoned the vessels in 1848, the Terror had become a tomb of ice. Some believe the men succumbed to starvation, scurvy, or the silent creeping madness that follows long isolation in the dark. Years later, Inuit hunters spoke of a ghost ship drifting through the mist, a skeletal vessel inhabited only by the wind. When the wreck of the Terror was finally located in 2016, it stood upright on the seabed, preserved in perfect, terrifying stillness. Why was the anchor deployed? Why did the ship appear untouched by the violent crush of the ice? Some suggest the crew returned to the ship to die in a place that felt like home. Others argue that no living soul could have navigated that vessel into the bay where it was found. The Terror remains a silent sentinel, guarding secrets of a failed odyssey that no records can fully explain. The ice has kept its counsel, leaving us with nothing but the haunting image of a ship that sailed into the void and simply refused to be forgotten. What would you do if you were trapped in a frozen wasteland, miles from civilization, while the very air around you seemed to hunger for your sanity? In the winter of 1845, the Erebus and the Terror set sail from England, commanded by the seasoned Sir John Franklin. Their mission was to chart the final uncharted section of the Northwest Passage, a noble pursuit that promised glory. Instead, it became a descent into a nightmare from which none returned. When the two state-of-the-art ships became locked in the relentless, suffocating grip of the Arctic pack ice, the expedition turned into a slow, agonizing struggle for survival that lasted for years. Years later, Inuit hunters spoke of white men walking across the ice, stumbling like madmen, dragging heavy sleds loaded with inexplicable, useless treasures, silverware, books, and even a heavy writing desk, rather than the life-saving supplies they so desperately needed. Some believe that lead poisoning from their tinned food stores clouded their minds, turning captains into delirious wanderers. Others suggest that something far more ancient and terrifying was waiting for them on those jagged, desolate ice floes, driving the crew to discard their humanity in the face of the encroaching frost. We found their graves, we found their relics, but the true record of their final, hollow breaths remains buried under miles of shifting, unforgiving permafrost. What were they running from in those final, freezing hours? And why did they choose to carry the artifacts of a life they would never see again, rather than the tools of their salvation? The wind still howls over the Victoria Strait, carrying whispers of a tragedy that refuses to be forgotten. Imagine a landscape so desolate that the wind itself sounds like a mourning choir. You are trekking through the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Canadian wilderness, far from the warmth of civilization, when you stumble upon a campsite frozen in time. This is not a place of tragedy marked by struggle or violence. It is a place of inexplicable stillness. You find the canvas tent still standing, taut against the biting frost, and inside, the embers of a campfire long dead. Personal belongings are scattered exactly where their owners left them. A pipe resting on a wooden crate, a half-finished journal entry, and fur-lined boots neatly aligned by the entrance. But the men who belonged to these items, they are gone. There are no footprints leading away from the site, no signs of a panicked retreat, and no scattered remains to suggest the intervention of predators. It is as if, at a singular, silent moment, the world simply exhaled and inhaled, and these souls were plucked from the fabric of reality. Some believe a sudden, localized geological anomaly forced them into a desperate, aimless flight into the white void, while others whisper of a more ancient, disorienting presence native to the Arctic barrens. The air here feels heavy with a lingering, unseen intent. As you stand among these artifacts of a vanished life, you are struck by a cold realization. Whatever took them did not leave a trail, and the silence of the wilderness remains the only witness to their ultimate fate. Were they beckoned by something just beyond the horizon, or did they simply step into a doorway that refuses to be found again? Imagine you are standing at the edge of a vast, desolate expanse where the earth itself seems to swallow human presence whole. You follow a trail of scattered belongings, broken branches, and cryptic markers, convinced that they will lead you to a sanctuary or perhaps an explanation for a disappearance. But as you push forward, the path suddenly dissolves into nothingness, leaving you in a silent, suffocating void. Why does the trail lead to nowhere? In the case of the lost Franklin expedition, two mighty ships, the Erebus and the Terror, vanished into the frozen grip of the Arctic, leaving behind a haunting trail of artifacts strewn across the ice. A silver fork, a scrap of uniform, a pile of bleached bones, yet no survivors were ever found. It is as if the men simply walked until their footprints were erased by the relentless, howling wind. Some believe that madness induced by starvation or lead poisoning caused the crew to wander aimlessly into the blinding white horizon, guided by nothing but ghosts and desperation. Others suggest a more unsettling theory, hinting that they stumbled upon a place where the landscape defies geometry, folding in on itself until there is no return. There are no maps for where they went, only the chilling silence of the tundra, eternally guarding the secret of their final, aimless steps. Every piece of evidence we uncover only deepens the riddle, leaving us to wonder if some paths are never meant to be finished. We are left staring at an empty map, haunted by the realization that sometimes the search itself is the trap. Imagine standing in the vast, suffocating white expanse of the Canadian Arctic, where the horizon dissolves into the sky and the cold bites through bone. In 1930, a solitary Inuit hunter named Joe Labelle traveled deep into the frozen wilderness near Lake Anjikuni, seeking refuge in a village he had visited many times before. He expected the familiar smoke of hearth fires rising against the pale sky and the welcoming barks of sled dogs. Instead, he found a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. As he pushed into the cluster of stone huts, the stillness turned from unsettling to terrifying. The village was not merely empty, it felt abandoned mid-breath. Pots of food hung over fire pits that had long ago turned to cold, gray ash. Racks of dried fish remained untouched, yet the people were gone. Even more chilling were the caches of supplies left behind, and the rifles leaning against hut walls, possessions that no Inuit hunter would ever willingly abandon in the unforgiving tundra. The settlement was a ghost town of sudden, inexplicable departure. Some accounts suggest that the graves in the local cemetery had been unearthed and emptied, the earth strewn about as if something from below had clawed its way out. Labelle fled, his mind racing with shadows, eventually alerting the authorities to what he had discovered. When search parties finally pushed through the blinding blizzards, they found no footprints, no struggle, and no trail leading away into the biting wind. The villagers had simply vanished into the shroud of the north. What force could compel an entire community to walk into the lethal Arctic night without their warmth, their weapons, or their supplies, leaving their existence to be swallowed by the shifting snow? The mystery remains a frozen wound in history, a riddle of ice and absence that defies every logical explanation. How many secrets can a frozen wasteland swallow before the earth itself decides to reveal them? Imagine standing in the heart of the desolate Siberian tundra, where the horizon stretches into an endless, biting gray void, and suddenly, you stumble upon something that should not exist. Deep within the permafrost, researchers have unearthed strange, metallic relics that defy any conventional explanation. These are not tools of simple nomadic tribes, nor are they remnants of any known colonial expedition. They are artifacts forged from alloys that should not have been mastered for centuries, etched with intricate, swirling patterns that seem to map constellations not visible from our hemisphere. Some believe these objects were left by a civilization that vanished long before recorded history, a culture that somehow thrived in the absolute zero of the Arctic. Others suggest they are evidence of a geological anomaly, where the shifting Earth has spat up items from an entirely different epoch. When you hold them, there is a lingering, unnatural chill that seems to seep through leather gloves, a cold that feels as though it belongs to the vacuum of space rather than the surface of the planet. There is no trail of footprints leading to these sites, no campfires, no remains, only these inexplicable objects sitting in the ice like silent witnesses to a forgotten tragedy. We look at them, and we are forced to wonder, were these travelers fleeing something, or were they simply erased by the very land they sought to conquer? The tundra keeps its mouth shut, but these relics remain, whispering of things that were lost to time long before we ever learned to record our own history. You are left staring into the frost, feeling the weight of an ancient, hollow silence that offers no comfort and absolutely no answers. What drives a man to cross the threshold of humanity, to cast aside the deepest taboos of his existence in the name of a few more hours of shivering, ragged life? When the Erebus and Terror were finally swallowed by the crushing silence of the Arctic ice, they left behind a trail of sorrow that continues to haunt history. But it was not merely the cold that froze the blood of the Victorian public. It was the whispered, terrifying reality of cannibalism. Why were these claims so deeply disturbing? Perhaps because they shattered the myth of the noble, disciplined British explorer. These men were the pride of the empire, trained in the highest traditions of duty and decorum, yet the physical evidence found decades later told a gruesome story of desperate, final acts. Explorers found human bones, not scattered by natural causes, but meticulously broken and scarred by metal blades, as if in a butchery. This was not the chaotic frenzy of survival one might imagine, but a calculated, clinical dismantling of one's own shipmates. The horror lies in the silence of those final days. Did they hold onto their prayers while the knife descended? Did they look away as they consumed what remained of their brothers in arms? It is the cold, methodical nature of this desecration that forces us to question what hides within our own core when the light fades and the last hope of rescue dissolves into the frost. We recoil because we fear that, under the weight of such absolute isolation, the thin veneer of civilization might simply crack, revealing a creature driven by nothing but the terrifying, primal instinct to endure at any cost. Some believe it was a necessary descent into madness, while others insist it was a desperate attempt to sustain a flicker of life against an indifferent, frozen god. We may never know the truth, but the broken bones remain as a grim testament to a boundary crossed and never recovered. Have you ever stood at the very edge of the world, where the horizon dissolves into an endless, biting gray mist, and felt the distinct, cold sensation of being watched by someone who simply should not be there? Imagine walking across the vast, desolate expanse of the high Arctic, miles from any known settlement, only to stumble upon a set of human footprints. They are fresh, crisp, and deep, carved into the virgin snow as if the walker had just stepped away a moment before. But as you follow them, your heart begins to hammer against your ribs because these tracks do not lead toward shelter or warmth. They march with terrifying, unwavering precision directly into the heart of a jagged, impassable glacial crevasse. There is no trace of a return path, no struggle, and no equipment scattered in the white void. The silence here is heavy, a physical weight that presses down on your chest, and the realization hits with the force of a frozen gale. The person you are tracking did not simply walk into the abyss, they seem to have evaporated into the thin, biting air. Some local legends whisper of ancient, restless spirits tethered to these frozen wastes, souls who lost their way centuries ago and now lure the living into the crushing darkness of the earth. Others suggest that these phantom trails are a cruel trick of nature, a psychological distortion born from the isolation of the tundra, where the mind fractures under the crushing solitude. Yet, as you kneel by the edge of that dark, bottomless split in the ice, looking down into a darkness that seems to stare back, you know the truth is far stranger. The tracks are real, the cold is absolute, and the mystery of those who vanish without a footprint remains a hollow, haunting echo in the wind that never truly dies. What lies beneath the eternal silence of the Siberian permafrost, preserved in a deep freeze that defies the passage of centuries? We often think of ice as a tomb, a way to lock away history, but what if the ground itself is hiding something that was never meant to be found? Across the vast, desolate stretches of the Yamal Peninsula and the remote Siberian tundra, hunters and scientists have occasionally stumbled upon remnants of civilizations and anomalies that simply do not align with our understanding of human migration. There are tales whispered among the indigenous Nenets people about forbidden zones, areas of the permafrost where the earth behaves in ways that baffle modern geology. Some believe that these regions house subterranean structures, ancient, stone-hewn chambers that predate known settlements by thousands of years. It is not merely the harshness of the environment that keeps these secrets. It is the sheer, unsettling nature of what occasionally emerges from the melting slush. Are these merely forgotten outposts of long-lost tribes, or is the permafrost guarding something far older, an architectural riddle buried before the dawn of recorded history? When the ground yields, it does not reveal artifacts of comfort. It reveals anomalies that challenge the timeline of human existence. As the permafrost softens under the heat of a changing world, we must ask ourselves, are we truly ready to face the truth buried in the ice, or are some mysteries better left to sleep in the eternal cold? Imagine a rescue party hacking through dense, suffocating jungle foliage or braving the biting winds of an Arctic wasteland, their hearts pounding with the desperate hope of finding survivors. They follow the trail, expecting to find the standard remnants of human struggle, campsites, medical supplies, or perhaps the tragic bodies of the lost. Instead, they find a silence so profound it feels intentional, as if the landscape itself has scrubbed the earth clean. This is the recurring nightmare of history, the phenomenon where rescue missions find only shadows. When searchers reached the abandoned village of Roanoke, they found a single word carved into a post and the heavy, chilling weight of an empty settlement, but no bodies, no signs of battle, and no explanation for where an entire population had vanished in the blink of an eye. Years later, when the search teams finally breached the silent, ice-locked decks of ships lost in the Great Lakes or the deep blue of the Atlantic, they often discovered half-eaten meals on tables, untouched personal belongings, and a ship perfectly maintained, yet devoid of a single soul. Some suggest a sudden, localized panic or a meteorological event, but those theories wither when confronted with the sheer lack of physical traces. Why is there never a struggle? Why are the tools left behind, yet the masters of those tools are nowhere to be found? When we walk into the void to retrieve the lost, we expect to find the physical consequences of tragedy. But reality often leaves us with nothing but the haunting sensation that the missing never left. They were simply claimed by something we cannot see. The abyss does not just consume, it erases, leaving behind a vacuum where history once stood, mocking our need for answers and leaving us staring into an empty expanse, wondering who, or what, was watching from the trees. Imagine holding a parchment that promises wealth and immortality, only to discover it leads directly into the throat of oblivion. This is the harrowing reality of the Piri Reis map, a relic that has haunted cartographers and historians for centuries. While the world remembers it for its uncanny depiction of the Antarctic coastline, centuries before modern man officially set foot there, the true darkness lies in the failed expeditions that dared to follow its jagged lines. Sailors obsessed with the map's hidden meridians vanished into the Southern Ocean, swallowed by storms that seemed to defy the natural laws of meteorology. Some believed the map was not a guide for trade, but a warning written in ink and shadow, marking places where the veil between our world and the unknown is dangerously thin. One theory suggests that the map illustrates lands that have since been reclaimed by the abyss, shifting with a rhythm known only to the Earth itself. Every time a ship attempted to verify these anomalous landmasses, the ocean turned hostile, as if protecting a secret buried deep beneath the permafrost. The crews did not just lose their way, they ceased to exist, leaving behind only salt-crusted logs and frantic, ink-stained entries about mountains that hummed in the dark. As you look at the faded lines, you have to wonder, is it a flawed masterpiece or a deliberate lure designed to lead the curious into the silent, frozen maw of eternity? Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, they are meant to be feared. What if the very air you breathe could turn against you, whispering commands that logic cannot override? We look at the sea and see only water, but those who have vanished in the clutches of the storm often leave behind scenes that defy the laws of human survival. Think of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers, who simply walked out into a tempest that should have been their grave, or the sailors found in locked cabins with expressions of absolute, primal terror etched onto their faces. What force could possibly compel a man to step away from the only shelter he has, walking willingly into a freezing, violent abyss? Some believe it is a localized pressure, a sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere that rattles the human nervous system until the instinct for self-preservation snaps like a dry twig. Others whisper of infrasound, low-frequency vibrations generated by wind and waves that resonate within the skull, inducing hallucinations and a deep, crushing sense of dread. But then, there are those who argue that some places on this earth are simply hungry, reaching out with unseen hands to pull the weary and the lost into a darkness from which no explanation can retrieve them. When the rational world fails to offer an answer, we are left staring at the empty horizon, waiting for a sound that should not exist, wondering if it was a voice that called them out, or just the silence of a world that no longer wanted them to remain. What happens to a man when the frozen horizon swallows his existence whole, leaving behind nothing but silence and the biting ache of a polar wind? For nearly 2 centuries, the Arctic has acted as a silent tomb for the Franklin expedition, a colossal failure of imperial ambition that remains etched into the ice like a jagged, unhealed scar. In 1845, 2 majestic vessels, the Erebus and the Terror, sailed into the white abyss with hopes of conquering the Northwest Passage. They never returned. When search parties finally began to peel back the layers of ice and time, they found a nightmare of lead poisoning, starvation, and a madness that defies simple explanation. Sailors were discovered miles inland, dragging heavy sleds loaded with fine china and silverware, useless trinkets in a landscape that demanded survival above all else. Some believe that the crew succumbed to a creeping paranoia, or perhaps the encroaching darkness of the long winter shattered their collective sanity. Yet, even after the rusted hulls were finally located on the ocean floor, the questions remain unanswered. Why did they abandon the safety of their ships? Why did they wander into the barren, frozen interior, marching toward an inevitable grave? The Arctic is not merely a geographic location. It is a sentient, unforgiving force that refuses to surrender its secrets. It preserves the dead in a state of eternal, icy suspended animation, guarding the truth of those final, desperate hours. We stare into that vast, pale emptiness, and we are forced to wonder, is it truly the harsh climate that keeps these stories hidden? Or is there something ancient and inherently wrong buried beneath the permafrost, something that simply does not want to be found.